Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be accompanied by Monkey Doodle Doodle Doo, the song that we just heard. Welcome to the final night of the 39th limited edition of the Giornate del Cinema Muto Pordenone Silent Film Festival. Thank you so much for being with us. Before we continue with the comedy, in a sense, the discussions of the comedy, I'm going to put in a serious note. Many of us have lost people in recent months. Over the last 12 months, the Giornate has lost a number of dear friends. And I'd like to mention their names here now. We will properly salute them next year when we can be live, when we can give them the proper standing ovation that they all deserve. But until then, Baby Peggy, Diana Sarah Carey, a great friend of the Giornate, someone who came to us several times, and really the last of the great silent film stars. She passed away in the past 12 months. Peter Kral, Thomas Elsesser, Bo Berglund, who of course did some essential work on Laurel and Hardy, and also I must mention two former Jean Mitry Award winners. Eileen Bowser and Paul Spare. Paul Spare, I'm happy to say, at least his last work, a significant volume on early biograph, will be coming out in the next year, published by John Libby. So we're very happy that this great legacy that he left us can still see the light of day. These were giants for all of us, and we miss them dearly. And as I said earlier, we will properly salute them in person next year here in Pordenone in the Teatro Verdi. With that important salute over now, I'm delighted to be able to welcome some special guests who can discuss the films that we've just seen, the joy that we've just experienced. So first, I'd like to welcome Rob Stone, moving image curator at the Library of Congress, and also author of an very important volume from 1996. Yes, Laurel Or Hardy. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome. Sorry.
Oh, just glad to be here.
Great to have you. I'd like to next welcome Serge Bromberg from Lobster Films in Paris, archivist, showman, musician, and filmmaker.
Merci beaucoup, Jay.
Merci à toi, Serge. Bienvenue. Neil Brand, our dearly beloved musician, joining us from London.
Hi, all.
Hello, Neil. And Victoria Riskin. Victoria, who's joining us from Martha's Vineyard. Victoria was president of the Writers Guild of America. She also was director of the Human Rights Watch for a number of years. She's a producer, she's a writer, and she's also the author last year of an absolutely wonderful volume, Fay Wray and Robert Riskin, a Hollywood memoir. Thank you very much, Martha. Because Victoria is the daughter of Fay Wray and Robert Riskin, and it seemed apt that she would join us this evening, given that we've just seen her mother at the age of 18 in one of her early roles with Hal Roach. So thank you very much for joining us. We will also have another special guest who will be arriving shortly, who I'll introduce when he comes. Before then, Rob, I was going to start off by asking you, since the publication of your book in 1996, how many other Laurel or Hardy films have been discovered? You're on mute.
Mike.
Still mute.
We did this during rehearsal, and I still got it wrong. Okay, take two. A bunch. I'd have to count them up in the dozens. In fact, earlier this week on Nitrateville, some guy posted about a third of a reel of a plump and runt called Lifesavers is now been found. They show up all the time. I was looking in the vaults a while back and came across a film that said amusement park or something like that, and said Catherine Grant. And I thought, well, Catherine Grant was in Hal Roach films. I pulled it out and figured out that it was a movie called Laughing Ladies, which features Oliver Hardy. So, you know, they're kind of hiding everywhere, and it's been in the dozens. As you can see from the show, some that were kind of around, something like Detained or the Rent Collectors. They were kind of around, but certainly not looking the way Serge has turned them into. The Rent Collector was only available kind of a dupe of a copy of the dupe TV thing that you could hardly watch. And just watching it today, I was amazed at how good of a movie it is. So there have been dozens, and I still think there's more out there to be found.
Serge, I wonder, could you talk about the collaboration with the Library of Congress on this project, and also about the DVD that's been released?
Well, first of all, it's a love story between Rob and I. I must say that when he started his book, I didn't know Rob, and he sent me a message saying, "I understand you may have one or two Stan Laurel films that I have not seen," and I sent him everything I could send. And since that moment, every time he could find something and I could find something, he's more the Hardy type, I'm more the Stan Laurel type. We would like correspond with each other. I must also admit that my aim in the Lobster collection, one of my aims, is to find all the Stan Laurel solo comedies. So whenever something pops up, I call Rob and tell him what I found. So the collaboration was fairly natural. About 5 or 6 years ago, Rob and I said, well, why don't we do a new, you know, we've done what they call the slapstick symposium with Kino that came mostly from Lobster, with Oliver and Stanley. And finally, we decided to work together on new entries, on newer restorations, basically improve everything that was done before, which is why you will not see some of the major titles like Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride, on which nothing new happened. But on the others, everything that we could bring back to life, we did. It took 3 to 4 years. Basically, Library of Congress scanned everything they had. We scanned everything we had in the Lobster collection. And basically, Lobster supervised the reconstruction from every element we could find here, there, and of course, everywhere. There are many other archives involved. And then we collaborated on the choice of the musicians, which are mostly the musicians from Mostly Lost, and the musicians that had done previously a pre-existing score. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's like a hand-in-hand production. Who does what does not really matter. What's important is that all the films are now, well, you can see in the back of Rob, if he speaks, the new DVD that we've done for France. And soon there will be a Blu-ray from Flicker Alley, I think by the end of the year, with the same films, but in Blu-ray, and of course for the American region. So you see, collaboration between archives. That's the way we like it.
Fantastic. I'm curious what you mentioned. There's Laurel people and there's Hardy people. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, Rob will elaborate first.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the reason I was attracted to Hardy a little bit more than Laurel is, frankly, I kind of go for the underdog. And in this case, Hardy's always kind of been put at the same, well, Stan Laurel was a comedy genius, and he did this, he did that. Oh, and Oliver Hardy showed up and did his bit. And I got more intrigued with the Hardy films than the Laurel films, because if you watch the breadth of his work, he brought a lot to the table. He may not have been sitting in the story meetings like Stan was, but he brought a lot to the table. And he was actually born of movies. Stan came out of music hall and vaudeville in America. Babe started in movies. He's a movie actor. And I think you can see that he was a lot more comfortable in front of the camera early on than Stan was. And I just have always been drawn to Hardy just because in a lot of cases, even amongst Laurel and Hardy people, they seem to be slightly dismissive of him to Stan's favor. Absolutely love Stan Laurel, but I kind of lean a little bit towards the Oliver Hardy side of things.
Okay, well, my point of view now, if you allow me, Jay, uh, the when you see the films of Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel separately, you can see that Oliver was a man from film, and he improved in acting, script writing, using his body, and eventually became the star that we know. Stan Laurel is more elaborate because, first of all, he came from England, from the vaudeville. He was trained in the same school and the same Carnot factory as Charlie Chaplin, and eventually did his first show with Chaplin in the United States and became his understudy. So at the end of the day, you have the same route of Stan Laurel from vaudeville to film, which took longer and which is different from the Chaplin side. But you can see the same DNA evolving in a different way. It's also true that, as Rob just said, Stan Laurel was the comedy genius. Leo McCarey specified that Stan Laurel insisted on being paid double than Oliver Hardy on anything they did. So basically, they negotiated Hardy's salary and they doubled for Stanley because Stanley was the one working and Hardy was the one having fun and acting and doing his job. So there are two ways, but when you see there is no film directed by Oliver Hardy. There are many films directed by Stan Laurel. We just saw one, Moonlight and Noses. And actually, we can be convinced that just as Chaplin in 1914 was directing the very first film he did, although Harry Lehrman was named on the bill, just the same way, when Stan Laurel was on the set, he was the one actually directing the film.
I'm wondering, did you grow up watching Laurel and Hardy films?
In France? Well,
sorry. This is for Serge. This is for Victoria.
Oh,
sorry about that. If you can, yeah. Did you grow up watching?
Yeah. So did I grow up watching Laurel and Hardy films? Probably not as much as today. I wish I had. I certainly did know Stan Laurel and Hardy. I mean, they're just brilliant and genius together. And I'm an and girl. I love them both. But in truth, so much was kind of lost or shoved aside. It was considered old-fashioned, and it's now their genius is being given the kind of attention it deserves, partly because of the preservation work that's being done both by Serge and by the Library of Congress. And I think it's thrilling to see these pieces because you're seeing the beginning of the motion picture industry. You see brilliant timing and humor. And it's, for me, it's like just going back to the beginnings of my parents. Both my parents worked in silent films. Seeing their beginnings. It's a very intimate feeling for me. So I'm seeing it with a much more mature eye, I hope.
Well, I'm going to bring in one more guest at the moment, somebody who met Laurel and Hardy, and that is our dear Director Emeritus, David Robinson.
Welcome,
Hello, David.
I shouldn't be here because I'm waiting to have a tooth put back, and it's very unbecoming, but there we are.
That's quite all right, David.
You won't look.
The lighting is fine, so we don't see the missing tooth so much. Don't worry about it.
Right.
Of course, you interviewed Laurel and Hardy in 1954. Is that right?
It was actually 53, November 1953. It was the first interview I ever did. I was 23 years old, and they were wonderful. They were so courteous because I was 23 years old, a bit of a mutt, and I arrived there, and I'd forgotten my pencil. And of course, in those days, you have to have a notebook and pencil. You didn't have anything to record it with. And Oliver, who was marvelous. I mean, he was a mountain of a man. He was enormous. You can't believe how big he was. And without a smile, without showing any humor at all, he reached in his pocket and gave me a pen with great courtesy. They were absolutely marvelous. They were so out of fashion. This was the great thing, because I was very excited because they were in the music hall in London, and I said to Sight and Sound, look, can I'd only just started to work for Sight and Sound, and I said, can I go to an interview with Laurel Or Hardy? They said, why would you want to do an interview with them? You know, they were nothing. You know, they really, and so I had to. I'm always a bit ashamed when I go back to the article, because I had to sort of start by saying, well, we know that they're not the great ones and they've made some bad films, but, and my but was pretty persuasive, thanks really to how collaborative they were. And at that time, of course, there was no filmography, so you didn't know. So when they mentioned a film like Putting Pants on Philip, I said, oh, write that down. Yes, with Ollie's pen. Write that down, because we'll have that title. No filmography, nothing in the history book. So what I got from Stanley, who was very, very articulate, told me everything, knew what to tell me, told the whole story, how they worked, how they met, the first films they made, and he remembered everything, and they were wonderful. And again, here, this 23-year-old mutt who'd forgotten his pen, they were so incredibly courteous with me. And their wives are not really like the wives in Stan and Ollie. They were very much more like the wives in the film. And they were and interrupting things like that. And suddenly Oliver put up his hand and said, can't you see I'm talking to this gentleman? Well, I was 23.
Wonderful.
They were absolutely, they were great. And Oliver was very, very serious. And Stanley laughed and giggled all the time, but with incredible facts. And he knew what to tell me, told me how they worked, you know, how he liked to really to film everything in sequence, how he liked to edit every sequence, so and so he could adapt. He gave me a very, I looked it out again, I found it again, and it's to read now. It's a very it's still a very a precise way of how they worked. Unfortunately, John McCabe was in London at that time, and I think he read it, and we met in time for him to start on his book, which changed the whole picture. Because when Jack McCabe did his 2 books, it was all changed, and they were back again.
Mm.
It was a privilege.
Yes, Serge.
Though, just one little thing. They were old-fashioned in the late 40s or early 50s. Remember that Charlie Chaplin himself had the opportunity of buying back the rights of all the Mutual films in 1963. And he said, why would I bother buy this? I'm totally out of the way. No one remembers me, and those films are absolutely useless. So Chaplin, about his own work and his major short films, was not even interested anymore. So you see, it's not only Laurel and Hardy. I guess the whole group of silent comedians was in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
David, I loved when you made a hand gesture when you showed how Oliver Hardy gave you the pen. And watching the films with Oliver Hardy here now, I was really I wound up watching his hands the whole time and seeing how he was moving them. And Neil, I was wondering how much you pay attention to something like that, something like how expressive a hand can be. And if so, how do you transform that into music?
Oh, hugely. Comedy is so much about body language, and the great comics understand that with their bodies, they're not just putting across gags, they're putting across character. And it's really interesting coming in on this conversation now after the Bob and Serge thing about Oliver or Stan, is that I think, and I may be wrong about this, but what makes Oliver Hardy and Stan Laurel work as Laurel and Hardy a team, and these films have really helped to show us this, is that in a way, Stan Laurel is David Lean and Oliver Hardy is Alec Guinness. And they kind of meet each other on a directorial and partnership basis. And what Oliver Hardy needed that he got from Stan was for his character to be that much more out. He's not just a big guy. He's a big guy with problems. And Stan gets that thing of, let's not just put Ollie in difficult situations. Let's give him problems. Let's give him marital problems. Let's give him the problem that he's cold. Let's give him the problem that his shoes don't fit. Let's give him the problem of this problem, that problem, that problem. And suddenly you have two human beings who are making great comedy together. And I do think that as a musician, what you notice with Laurel and Hardy, I mean, I loved doing these films. I did absolutely love doing them. But you can see that Hardy is still just a big, tough guy who's being used as a foil for our hero to go up against. Stan's imagination is massive. I mean, it's like Buster Keaton size. He has this incredible surreal idea of what could work when he's directing. So yeah, hence, you know, the body over the shoulder in Moonlight and Noses. Can this body come back to life again as the guy is carrying him back? The wonderful Monty Python and the Holy Grail stuff of the knights riding with wearing their horses. And I have to say, I've read everywhere about When Nights Were Cold. It's not a takeoff of When Night of that film. It is an absolute shot-for-shot takeoff of Robin Hood, which is a big bar to aim for. But he really does do that. And so you then get, of course, Laurel and Hardy will then do Fra Diavolo. They will do the most superb takeoff of opera or operetta or whatever, because Stan understands the comedy nature of really big, well-known pieces. I think it's no surprise that he was, in effect, a parodist for the first few years of his life. And I've got to say it right now, I, for one, do not want to go to my grave without seeing the first reel of When Nights Were Cold, because I think that could turn out to be one of the comedy masterpieces we haven't yet had a chance to see.
I want to see the end of Dr. Pickle and Mr. Pride also. Then when I've seen both, I can go to my grave.
That'll be good too.
I was late because I was actually watching the films, but I didn't get any far enough.
Rob, would you like to comment on some of the things that Neil just talked about?
Well, you know, I agree with him on I think Stan, his solo years, he was most successful when he did the parodies. And I always like to point out that I saw they used to call them travesties instead of parodies back in the day. And so I love it because I looked in a trade journal and it said Stan Laurel's new film is a travesty, which means something different today. But you know, he did The Nights Were Cold right before or after Mud and Sand, and he did Rupert of Hee Haw, and he seemed to do his best in those kind of situations, because I think in some ways he was still searching for a character, but in those movies he kind of attached somebody else's character a little bit, so he didn't have to do quite so much, I guess, effort trying to build a character. It was more about the gags and the comedy. So I think those tend to work. I mean, I think the successful thing about Laurel and Hardy is that they found a character to be in. And I think the things that were said about setting up a problem for Babe and you know, I mean, people nowadays might look at some of their work and say, well, it's too formulaic that, you know, but people got to understand, you weren't watching these guys 4 or 5 times in a row. You'd watch them 2-3 months later, you'd go out to the movies and you'd watch them again. So you wanted that familiarity. But I agree absolutely with I think Stan as a solo artist worked best with the parodies. And I think you find it sometimes in a solo work. I think Babe was at his best when he was, you know, on the wrong end of a problem. So,
Victoria, your mother began, like so many other actresses who later became stars, both very young and also in short comedies. So I was really quite struck in your book. You talk about in 1924 with Hal Roach, she's already making $75 a week, which is awfully good in 1924. And yet she's churning these films out. Do you have a sense of what her relationship was to different kinds of comedy? I mean, what did she enjoy?
Well, it's first of all, it's true. She started out at $60 a week, and then she graduated to $75. And I think first of all, I think the role for women in a lot of these films is to be kind of the tool for the comedy, not the comedy itself. Whether it's a Charlie Chase film or the Stan Laurel film. But I think she was just thrilled to be working. And when I watched her, this is the first time I've seen this film, by the way, the Moonlight and Noses. And I was struck by, she was very new to the filmmaking business, how comfortable she seems to be on film and how unrestrained, even though it's a somewhat, it's not a comedic part, but she seems to feel comfortable on film. And I think that was kind of remarkable for a girl who she had gotten on the bus and gone to Hal Roach Studios and asked F. Richard Jones, could she get some work? And he gave her a 6-month contract just based on, she just walked into the studio. And she needed the money. I mean, her family was very poor, and she became very quickly the sole support. So I'm not really asking you a question about how she related to the comedy, but I think she loved it later when she was doing sound pictures. And as we all know, she tended to be for a while cast either as the beautiful girl, but often the lady in distress, as in King Kong. She sought out some comedy roles because she missed that sort of crazy chance to be more free, I think. And so she did a movie called The Affairs of Cellini and another one later, Murder in Greenwich Village, in which it's much more, her roles were more comedic. But I don't think it was easy for women to break through and be the stars of these films. That wasn't how it worked. And these guys had come, like Stan Laurel, these guys had a long, robust background already in doing comedy on stage. So I think I haven't answered your question, so that's pretty good. Sort of like the debates for the candidates.
Can I just say something to Victoria?
I'm just going to say whatever I think.
It's good.
Victoria, can I say that the most wonderful and beautiful guest we ever had in Pordenone was Fay Ray?
Well, the truth was, as a human being, and I think that's always kind of interesting, who was this person really? She was an incredibly warm, David, as you perhaps could tell, a very warm human being, very generous, and very smart. And a lot of the young men who survived Hollywood with their dignity intact were incredibly smart. And because
witty.
a certain amount of character to navigate the challenges of working that hard, of all the pressures of the who's up and who's down, and the contracts and the money, and so So thank you for saying that, because she was as wonderful as a mother as she was the person you met on stage at the festival or that you saw on film. She was a lot of fun. She was a lot of fun.
No, I found that too. She was great.
Love hearing it. Yeah, but I must say, I do think that if it weren't for all of you, silent films would be forgotten. I mean, there is such a heartfelt dedication that you give to this part of the medium, and you begin to see the genius of it. And by the way, when I met some of you in at the Silent Film Festival in San Francisco, and the music that was brought to the Wedding March was, and many of the films that I enjoyed there, was just astounding, and just elevated the whole experience to an emotional peak that was so refreshing. I have this image of my mother in this little tiny town. She grew up in Lark, Utah, which was a mining town, and it was rough, and it was a hard life. And the only escape that she had was going to what was the little movie theater. It was the church on Sunday, and Friday night it was the movie theater. And for so many people then, and still now, but particularly then when life was very hard and harsh, being able to escape into the life of the people on the screen, Mary Pickford, and it was a way out. It was an emotional way out that gave you a sense of optimism and hope. And she just believed that whole world so strongly that I think that's what made it possible for her in her very improbable journey to Hollywood, because she came when she was 14 in the care of a young man who was a photographer and took charge of her and thought she had a future. And they were, at that time, going through a global pandemic, the big flu epidemic, Spanish flu, they called it. And everyone had been sick, and there was no money in the house. And so I think her mother said, let's see what the fates bring, and maybe Faye will get into the movies. And they all lived off of that hope. Things got complicated, but that makes for an interesting story, and that's why everyone watching is going to buy my book, right?
Exactly. I'm going to read out. There's a lovely comment from Bob Gelfand here. Greetings to friends from England, including Mark Fuller and others from San Pedro, California. And looking out my window at the spot where Laurel and Hardy meet in Putting Pants on Philip, and where Max rides past at the end of The Three Must Get Theirs, which is a very nice thing to hear. And particular thanks to David Robinson for the experiences of the past 21 years. So that's lovely to hear and to read. Rob, I'd like you to talk a little bit about Stan as director, when he began directing, and how you see. Do you have a sense that he would have liked to have continued that in a more? I mean, clearly he's involved in many ways, even when his name isn't on the credits. But
right. Well, I think he didn't start name on the title directing till 1925, till his third and last tenure with the Howe Roach Studios. But I think you look back at his work, Joe Rock, Ian Anderson, his previous work with Roach. You can't miss his input. Now, how much of his input was, writing or gag construction, and how much of it was actual directing, I don't know. And I was just looking up to double check. This was Moonlight Noses was the fourth film since his return to Roach. Fourth film, third with Fay Wray. She was in his first Chasing the Chaser, the second Unfriendly Enemies. Both of those were Jimmy Finlayson films. And then he did a Clyde Cook, and this is his second Clyde Cook. And he goes through a good portion of 25 directing, and then he kind of disappears. He's into the writing, and he comes back and directs, usually in collaboration with Richard Wallace in 26 things like Raggedy Rose and Madam Mystery, things like that. I don't think he ever quit directing. I was actually thinking about this before the show today. I wonder a little bit, he tended to be content with or happy with the kind of directing from behind. I just wonder if he had gone ahead and pushed and had his name, Twice Two, directed by Stan Laurel, Blotto, directed by Stan Laurel. I wonder if that would have had any effect on when they left Roach, if that would have gave him any different cachet, because he really never quit directing his movies. The trouble with the Fox films or those later MGM films were that he wasn't allowed to do that kind of direct-to-director kind of approach. He just kind of had to stick with the director. So I think, I don't know. I don't know if he could have ever been content. I mean, I think we obviously see he went and directed for Roach. Some people say he had to direct because he was under contract to Joe Rock. But you can just see by the end of 25 into 26, he's creeping back in front of the camera. I think he was too much of a performer to not want to do that. But I think, obviously, with this film, you can see that he most certainly could have given up the acting and been quite a good comedy director.
There's a comment from Benedetto Gemma saying that Hardy said in an interview that he was the director of some Larry Seaman films, uncredited. He's suggesting that in The Rent Collector, he has almost half the film alone in the barbershop, and he's suggesting maybe he directed part of that.
I hadn't heard that before, but it's certainly, I think there's a certain amount of evidence that points towards that. After he got done doing the Plump and Runt films at Vim, he was still at Vim, and it started to break up. But anyhow, he directed his last half dozen or films that he made for Vim. And then his company, the Babe Hardy Company, basically became the King Bee comedy company with Billy West, and they brought in a different director. But he actually did some directing back in 1916. And then in 25, Seaman made a film called Stop, Look, and Listen, which is actually talk about films that are lost forever that aren't lost forever. There's now a version with Japanese subtitles that has just been found of that film, and he co-directed that film. So he actually has a screen credit, although it's in Japanese. He has a screen credit for that film. So he wrote a couple of the Jimmy Aubreys that he was in. He co-wrote those. Knowing Seaman, I wouldn't doubt that that could happen. Although an awful lot of those films, I'd have to check the Rent Collector. I think the Rent Collector was co-directed by Larry Seaman and Norman Taurog. So I can't quite imagine that if you had Larry Seaman standing there and Norman Taurog there, that Hardy was going to be handed the megaphone. But I think if you look at the Seaman films, and then particularly if you look at the films that he made with Bobby Ray, and say 25, Stick Around, and those kind of things, a lot of those gags are from back in Hardy's earlier films. So he was involved in the gag construction and the story construction at some point. How much of a director he would have been, I don't know. Maybe he could have been a director, but I think he was better placed in front of the camera for all of our sake.
Neil,
I think it's a bit of a problem that we don't know. I was just going to say, it's a bit of a problem. We don't know the difference between a director and a writer-scenarist in this situation, because it does strike me that Stan Laurel was at his happiest if he was within a world that he'd already constructed. So hence the parodies. He knows where he is with the parodies. He knows where he's going to go. And also, when he then starts directing Laurel and Hardy, he can kind of understand a scenario that he has planned himself. He may not necessarily be the director, but he's kind of written it. And so as such, what is a director at the end of the day? It may be the guy on the megaphone, but it may be the guy who is the ultimate writer amongst the teams, who says, yes, that gag's good, and that gag isn't. And we're building towards this gag, and this gag is going to make the whole thing. It could be the car turning into a concertina, or it could be the point on a hole. That's why I think it's really, and as a director,
I think we've lost Neil.
I think Neil is frozen.
Yeah. If I may add something,
please.
Stanley had something that Oliver did not. Stanley had toured on stages. He knew what gag works. He knew what gesture works, and he also knew the timing. If you're too late or too early on an effect, it doesn't work. So he has probably tried everything. And although in cinema you don't hear the audience response, he knew what the audience response would be due to his experience on stage. And that's very precious. It's not by pure chance that Keaton, Stan Laurel, and Charlie Chaplin were the three most important stars in silent comedy. That's because they had that feeling of what the audience wants and when they expect it. It's all about timing. If the timing is right, then it's not funny. If it arrives a bit, half a second early or half a second later, then all of a sudden it becomes like a syncopation. And that Stan Laurel knew. I don't know if you heard me, but I was fairly good.
Mm-hmm. I have a feeling that once Oliver found Stanley, he was happy. He really was happy to leave it to him. They gave me the impression that Oliver would go off golfing and Stan would be working anything out. Then he could call and say, "I'm ready. We're ready. We can go." That was the impression they gave me. I'm sure that this changed just because he knew how much he could rely on Stanley, because Stanley had this just endless invention and all the skills that were needed.
David, I'd like to hear you address also what Serge was saying of the influence of having performed for a live audience, influencing who they became as film comedians.
Oh, I think this is true of all the great ones, really. I'm the only one who didn't really do much for an audience with an audience was Lloyd. But I mean, the others were really trained on stage very much. Keaton, Chaplin. I think that the stage and vaudeville were very, very important. Because think of so many of Chaplin's, his regular cast. So many of them had also come from vaudeville.
Neil, are you with us again? Yes, or at least audio, maybe.
Lost the picture.
Yeah. Okay. We'll come back to you in a minute. Okay, sorry. He was my next. I was going to ask him a few questions. There's a question from Twitch, I'm told. Okay. Here we are. Is Detained a parody or a travesty of a contemporary prison picture? This is Matthew Sweet writing, actually. I love this, particularly the amazing excess of the neck stretching scene. Also, we saw something rather shocking about Stan's character in this and When Nights Were Cold, Stan killing people and then shrieking in delight. Yeah, there is quite a lot of violence there. So would you define the film as a parody or a travesty? You're muted, Rob, sorry.
Am I here?
Yes.
I don't know. It's it's kind of hard sometimes if you're not paying attention to all the films that are released at the time. Some of the titles of movies that are put out. Isn't Life Terrible? Which is all the Hardy Charlie Chase film. Nowadays we think, oh, that's a funny title. Well, it's a takeoff on Isn't Life Wonderful? And I'm imagined Detained probably is, at least taking some stab at some prison movie. I don't know exactly if there's a direct one. I do like the note with Detained as with he's working with another guy through a good portion of that film. I really think that by 1924, Stan was really looking at teen comedy, and I mean that obviously it's all over the place with Moonlight and Noses, but Stan was looking for how to do his comedy in a team setting, and then I think with Hardy found the absolute team player. I mean, Hardy was again starring and directing films, and then someone came along and said, "Well, why don't you be the supporting character for Billy West when he does these Chaplin films?" And sure, okay, so he was a supporting character. And when those wrapped up, he went to LKO and he starred in films. He was mostly directed by Charles Parrott. He was starring in films at LKO, and then someone said, "Well, why don't you be a supporting character for Jimmy Aubrey and Larry Seaman over at Biograph?" Okay, I'll do that. He kind of slid between the two. So Stan by 24, 25 was looking for a team player, and Hardy was the consummate team player. So I drifted from the original question, but I wanted to get that part in.
If I can,
While we're waiting for, sorry, David, were you just saying something?
No, it's me, Jay. I was reading the question about the neck stretching scene in Detained, and I wanted to focus a bit on the restoration of that film. Everyone had seen or made available that film in a one-reel version, which is about 10 minutes, which is basically cutting the film down, which is an original two-reeler to one. And everyone thought, well, who did that condensation? Actually, that cut down version was probably re-released only in 16 millimeter in the 50s, probably with a track, and that version was duped and copied from 16 mil. So eventually, a man called Murray Glass was really a film person, a film collector, but also a print distributor, made available that film Detained under the title No Place Like Jail, which is actually a standalone solo comedy of the teens that does not survive, but Murray Glass didn't know. And so that material was available, but it was very poor. We were fortunate enough to come across the original nitrate that produced that 16 mil negative. So we have a very good sharpness on the film, except is the sharpness on the cut down version to one reel. And of course, the full two reel version did not survive. Very happily, I mentioned it, I think it was at Mostly Lost, with Elif Rongen from the I Film Museum Institute, who told me that there was an institution called the Fries Film Archive in Holland who had the reel 2 on nitrate. It had Dutch titles, but nevertheless, the complete version of the second half, the second reel, was there. So we made a 35 mil preservation on both elements, the cut down and the second reel. And that neck stretching scene did not exist in the one reel condensation. It only existed in the second complete reel. Now that means that the version that you've seen today, which is among the premiere presentations of that version, is for the first part only the abridgment. We are missing some scenes that were part of the complete reel one. Maybe we will find them. To tell you the truth, I think we have a clue where they are, and I'm probably about to get them. Which shows that even if we have the film, it every day brings new surprises, and so eventually you get the film complete. Two, for the rent collector that you've seen, there are three main sources. One from Bologna, the version that was shown about 20 years ago at the Cinema Ritrovato. There was one from Valencia that we duped, and there was a fine grain from Eclair nitrate that was stored at the CNC archive. But even with that, there were scenes missing that we only could find in a 16mm print. So you see, reconstructing a film brings a lot of surprises, sometimes different versions. There are harrowed versions of films that are known as two-reelers, but for example, in South America, there were four-reelers. So there were long, extended versions. Why, how, we don't really know. And that's what's so wonderful about collaborating in reconstruction. And eventually, that's what's so wonderful in having the film shown. And it's an honor as the final night of the 39th edition of the Pordenone Giornate del Cinema Muto.
Well, Serge, I can promise you that when you complete Detained, we will be happy to show it as many times as you expand it.
Okay, that's the deal. 2021, next year.
You've got it. Yep, no question at all.
I think the neck stretching scene is kind of classic Stan Laurel. You know, he kind of would go for those kind of, I don't know, macabre gags, or kind of, you know, they always said black magic, you know, when he lights his thumb to light the pipe in the Laurel and Hardy film, or he always had, in his films, he always had just straight gags, but every once in a while he had a gag that kind of had a bit of a twist to it. And something like that one would just seem to be kind of classic Stan.
Victoria, I'm going to go a little bit off piste here, but I can because I have the privilege of having you with us now. And I have a question which I've been wondering for a very long time, actually. And
the answer is yes.
Oh, it's a much more elaborate answer than that, I can promise you. In 1988, Clifford Odets' 1940 diary was published. And when I read it when it was published, I was really quite blown away by the description of your mother, because she came alive in a way that I had never read anywhere else. It wasn't a side of her that I knew, the intellectual, there's just a beauty to it all. And then your mother published her autobiography the following year in 1989. And I'm wondering what her response was. How did she feel having Odet's diary published, which was so personal, so complimentary in many ways, but that must have been quite it must have created some kind of emotional turbulence.
She did not tell me how she felt about that, and I didn't even know about the diaries until I was doing the research for my own book and read them just like you did, and felt that this masterful observer of human behavior and sensitivity, and such a fine writer, captured her in a way that probably no one else did. And part of it was he captured her hunger for intellectual life, and she felt that he was extraordinary, and he sent her music, and he really helped support her intellectual appetites. But she also, I found in the diary, there was a sense of her vulnerability. I don't know if you felt that, Jay, when you read it. And he captured that too. And I think what was such an interesting challenge for him and for her, she would have devoted herself to him. She was a very devoted person by nature, very loyal person. And her devotion, I think, intimidated him. Her goodness, her kindness, because underneath Clifford Odets was someone who had great doubts about himself, about his talent. He didn't really like himself. And she wanted to fix that. And he was afraid that if he devoted himself to her, he would be happy, and his his turbulence would go out the window, and so would his talent. What was actually quite interesting for me is that I then reached out and spent quite a bit of time with his son, who's living in Northern California, as I was preparing for the book, doing my own research. And we had long, interesting conversations about the complexity of his father. His father's been quite badly verbally abused as a young man. And then this very touching thing that the son said to me, because he was with his father when his father was dying of cancer. He was a teenager, and his mother had already died. And his father said, you know, Faye was the only person I really loved. And that just sort of was heartbreaking for me to hear. I'm relieved that my mother married my father. She made a much better choice. My father was an extraordinarily giving and kind and nurturing and supportive man, and also exceptionally bright. But also, I mean, Odette's description of my sister and his kind note to my mother when my sister was kidnapped by my mother's first husband. I mean, there was a lot there because of the richness of the way he could express himself. So the diaries were very revealing in a way, and it was much more the vulnerable woman, a woman who's vulnerable because she loves a man. And that was a bit tender for me to read. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Thank you very much for that. There's Neil. Are you? Yes, there you are. Hello, Neil.
Sorry about that.
Welcome back to the club.
It happened. You were in the middle of a discussion or of a sentence actually when we lost you. Do you want to continue that?
I'm so sorry, and I don't know when I dropped out. My Wi-Fi suddenly disappeared on me. I think the bottom line that I was aiming for was that the incredible imagination that gave us the stretched neck, for instance, is a Buster Keaton imagination. It is the imagination that takes the risk to go somewhere that we may find uncomfortable or surreal or odd. But when it came to having Oliver Hardy and himself and Roach making films, he really couldn't practice that kind of vast, imaginative, comedic idea because it was now two of them. And because they had to, if anything, move away from the fantastic, move away from the surreal, and become much more people that an audience would recognize as the guys down the road or the guys who lived upstairs. And the fact that Stan could make that jump from a surreal genius to someone who could make comedy out of the everyday and out of the domestic, and that the two of them then, when they get together, I'm sure that's where Ollie really makes the difference, because Stan gets that Ollie is a solid everyday character. So you have to have him going door to door. You have to have them carrying buckets. You have to have them doing basic working class jobs. And then the comedy will come, and it will then get surreal. And the surrealism of big business is that if someone's going to smash up their car, they're going to smash up his house. And suddenly we have the world that Laurel and Hardy are going to work in. But without these films, these kind of pre-Lapsarian films of Laurel and Hardy, we wouldn't have that sense of where all that's come from. And I do think they are incredibly rich, all of them. Larry Seaman was extraordinary, and what Oliver does with Larry Seaman is extraordinary. But it also explains a lot about Laurel and Hardy, but from a place I really wouldn't have expected it at all. Absolutely fascinating.
I saw both Serge and Rob, your heads nodding in agreement, and I'd love to have your comments about what Neil just said.
Well, I mean, I agree with him totally. I actually was thinking in my head, I think at Roach, that was kind of, the everyday people like Neil mentioned. Because, Charlie Chase is kind of an everyday man. Harold Lloyd was kind of an everyday man. And these weren't guys who had big, giant mustaches and big, elaborate. They weren't bizarre. They were the guy next door. I mean, let's face it, maybe on the fringe, but somebody that's a Stan Laurel or an Laurel Or Hardy or Charlie Chase, or they were close enough to being real to make them real funny, as opposed to the more just the earlier just outlandish slapstick characters. Larry Seaman was a little bit more of the kind of outlandish character, and he actually, when he went over and started doing movies at Educational and toned that down, it kind of took his comedy away, but it enhanced Stan and Babe. They always said that one thing that Babe Hardy liked to do is he liked to sit in lobbies of hotels and watch people. And I think that kind of shows in his movies, in that he is that guy. He's the guy that everybody knows. He's a real person. Stan's a real person, except they're not, And I think that's people can attach to those guys, where a clown is harder to attach to. You watch a clown you laugh at, you have nightmares about if you don't like clowns. But Laurel and Hardy were guys that at some point you knew somewhere, and that's why you could laugh at them. In some cases, me being a guy who's walked around my house looking for my glasses, and they've been right on my head, every once in a while you find yourself being Hardy or Laurel yourself. So I think Neil's dead on with his assessment.
Serge, do you want?
Well, I'll speak as an animation buff. Frank Tashlin went from animation to directing very good comedies. For me, it's all a matter of pacing. Basically, when you are in a parody and you're doing jokes and gags like Stan Laurel or Oliver Hardy did in their earlier films separately, you are in comedies. But what is thrilling is when surrealism, when that change of pace happens in real life, because it's much more funny. You have something going on perfectly logically, and then all of a sudden you have that push of genius that makes the whole thing irresistible. For example, remember, the thumb, that the lighter with the thumb. So what happens? Stan Laurel uses his thumb and light as a light. Okay, so Oliver watches it and very normally says, "What's going on? How can he do that?" So what does he do? He tries. That's perfectly normal. So he tries and it works. So that's fine. But then he burns himself. Oh, and that's what's funny. Everything is logical until it's not logical at all. So basically, it's like you need a backbone to derive from it and to build surrealistic jokes. The former films were totally surrealistic. When you watch Buster Keaton, he kept that surrealistic way until the end. His gags are absolute nonsense. Very logical, very well built, but totally nonsense. Chaplin went another way. He went the way of romanticism in 1915, 1916. He became to address to the audience who wanted love stories. So there were still a few gags. I mean, Chaplin was good at this, but it was more logical. 10 years after Chaplin did Tilly's Perched Romance, or I don't know, The Champion, Stan Laurel was extending a neck. You don't have that in Charlie Chaplin in 1915, and you would not have that because Chaplin's audience would not understand. It's a style in itself. That's why the style, which is surrealism intruding in reality, died with sound, because sound, of course, made the pace so normal that it was more and more difficult to have intrusion of surrealism. And I think that's what killed the slapstick comedy as we know it.
David, would you like to comment on that?
No, because I think it's so right. I think so. Just got it so exactly, and Chaplin's position, everything.
Perfect. There's a comment, by the way, someone who had recently seen the 1928 habeas corpus and was surprised at the similarities with Moonlight and Noses, which is something that, Rob, you mentioned in your really terrific catalog notes. By the way, the catalog will be published and will be available as a standalone volume. It won't only be online. We've gone over the 1 hour mark. I think this conversation could go on for another hour, but I can't do that, I'm afraid, as much as I would like to. There's of course, we all must have noticed the intertitle in Detained. I don't want to go into the cruel world, and I think we all kind of feel that. It's a terrible.
Oh yeah. Hey, that's Rob's routine. Every year at Mostly Lost, he picks one intertitle and prints it on our T-shirts. So,
did you use that one, Rob?
We haven't used that one because we pick one from one of the unidentified films, but we've done one about noodles and one about, they're kind of funny. They're just something funny to do. If we're getting to wrap up, can I say one thing?
I would love you to.
I've watched all these movies numerous times. You get them. You unpack them, you wind through them, you maybe put them on the flatbed if they're good for that. You get them scanned, you look at them. I think I did a few of the title works on the tape. You see these things silent, and that's what you do as a film archivist most of the time. You're not, you don't bring in a piano player Monday morning at 9 o'clock to play while you're on the Steenbeck. So you see these films silent. And once you're done with them, they go out, and I always cringe a little bit because you can take a really good movie and make it a really bad movie really quick. But oh my goodness, Neil Brand's music on these films was just incredible. I just cannot tell you how thankful I am that we had someone of his caliber playing for these films, because a good musician can enhance a screening, and a bad musician can have you out in the lobby buying an extra box of popcorn. And he just nailed it. So I just wanted to get that in.
And same for all the musicians
Thank you.
that you choose at Pordenone.
Yeah. Here. We are very lucky to have the best musicians in the world working on this festival. I'm very touched by what you say, Rob. But I think it's now no longer a questioned statement that these films need the best music possible, and that the music has such a massive job to do. Having said that, I had an absolute ball with these films. There was so much joy coming off them, and after however many months of lockdown in Britain, seeing these folk just finding ways to make us laugh and see the absurdities and grab hold of them and hold them to us. To be able to put music to that was a job that just felt like a privilege. And I do think this is what makes this material so timeless. It is there to give us a release. It was there to do that in the 1920s or even in the 19s, and it still does it now. And that release is the whole point of comedy. silent or otherwise. And I felt it first because I got to put the music to it. And I think everybody out there will have felt it tonight, that no matter how bad things get, the right people can just make us laugh. And that is an incredible gift to be able to hand on to people. And I'm just enormously proud to have been part of it. Seriously.
Now I have a lump in my throat, and having the five of you here with us, having Laurel and Hardy, having Fay Ray, is further proof of that the world maybe isn't all that cruel after all. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I want to say thank you for including me. It's just been a wonderful conversation. I feel I've been as much a participant watching this great circle of contributions by all of you. So it's just been an honor.
Thank you very, very much.
Can I say thank you for all the locked up people for this incredible festival that we've had, and I think it's gone so well. It's done so marvelously that I've been saying, why did we ever spend all that money on theatres? You know, I know you want the theatre, but all the same. And the musicians have excelled themselves. A completely different and striking score every night for our friend Dick Williams's logo or trailer or whatever we call it. It's been a thrilling week. Thank you.
Wonderful. David, I'm going to ask you to stay put for a bit. We have some other people who are wanting to say hello. But I'm going to say to Victoria, Serge, Rob, and Neil again, thank you very, very much for joining us, and see you in Pordenone in 2021.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Jay.
Neil, yeah. As I keep on saying throughout the week, this is hardly a one-man show. This has been an incredible effort by an amazing team of people involved with the Giornate, from the board of directors to the staff. The people dealing with translations are indefatigable. Evelyn Devald, the technical team from Carlo Montanaro, Elena Beltrame, and Andrea Tessitori. I'm not going to name them all because I've asked everybody who is available at this moment to appear on screen, because they're the ones that need to say hello and thank you.
Beautiful.
Chiara, Patat, Lino Jacob, Juliana Popin, Federica Dini. I can't say all the names. It's wonderful to see you all.
I think everybody's there.
Thank you.
And hey, hello. Wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. What a treat. Thank you so much for that. That's lovely.
Thank you, David. Lots of love to you, love to everyone, and see you soon. Stay safe.
Hope so. Yes. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.